All right, so today I've come a long way south down to England. I've come to Lattice Training in Chesterfield, and I'm here with Ollie today. And Ollie's going to put me through some testing. What are you going to get me to do today?
So we'll be really psyched to get you to do the main three tests that we're going to look at, which is MVC, so maximum voluntary contraction on a finger edge. We're going to look at RFD, so rate of force development. That's kind of like the contact strength. And then we're going to do the really fun test, which is critical force testing, and that's the fun bit for us to watch and the hard bit for you to do, which is all out 4 minutes of repeater hangs. So we're looking at your baseline endurance for basic terminology and how well you can sustain that maximum effort.
And I guess we can compare my data to your database of lots of other climbers, and that's interesting in itself. But is there anything that you think I might be able to walk away with to know to put it back into my own climbing?
Well, I hope so. We'll see what happens during the testing, but like you say, we have this really big database, and we've been lucky enough to work with loads of climbers of a similar level to yourself in terms of sort of those top grades at least. But also we'll look at your sort of scores compared to each other. Hopefully we'll be able to get some sort of interesting ideas about where to take your climbing forward, and maybe this will help influence your tactics over the coming season.
I mean, I suppose it's good if you don't find anything remarkable. You know? That's
a great thing. If you're finding nothing at all, then it's showing that what you're doing so far is actually really good, and you can keep going in the same way forward. If we find a major hole, that's something that could be addressed. But like we were discussing the other day and earlier, is that sometimes then you need to weigh up whether this is something that needs addressing, and all this will come out in a conversation after we see the results.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that, I've been training for more than 25 years, so I hope that in that time I've figured out what my own weaknesses are and tried to address them, at least partially, although everyone has their own biases and their own habits and things that they like to do as well.
And I think one thing for me going into this is I'm going to have like a slight bias as well, having seen people at this level and having seen your climbing in the past and watching your YouTube. So I'm trying to come into this from a completely neutral point, look at the numbers first, and then start having those discussions.
My priors going into this is that I think my finger strength on small holds is okay, but for the grade I climb, but not great. So I can usually do 8C on a sport trip in between a day and a week, and I've climbed 9A as a long-term project, and I've only done a couple, and I can usually climb 40B plus as a kind of medium to long-term project. So that's my level when I'm at my best. And right now I do actually feel quite close to my best. So I think my finger strength should be okay, but I don't think it's exceptional. I think my technique and tactics is my best strength, and that carries me.
And I think one thing we'll see is where does that compare your finger strength to the data set and where you think it might be at. But then also the other element of finger strength, that rate of force development, that contact strength, is maybe the maximal contractile force is really good, but your ability to contract quickly might not be as good. That's why that technique and tactics are even more required. And we've seen vice versa as well, where some people feel like they are really strong because they can catch hold and pull straight on them. But when you look at the slow contractile force, maybe they don't have the highest numbers. So we'll compare those two as well, because from your history and the way you've described your training, what I would assume might happen is that you might have a good slower contractile force that is in balance with those grades, but maybe your ability to recruit quickly is something that isn't quite there because of your trad background and your mixed disciplines. So maybe it feels sometimes why you're not as strong, it's the contractile speed rather than maximal force. But like I said, we don't know yet.
And obviously muscles can be made stronger, but see that rate of force development, the speed that you can go from zero force to maximum, is that trainable, and is it as trainable as maximal force?
Like anything, it'll be dependent a little bit on your genetics and your training history. I would say it's 100% trainable. The level of that trainability depends on what you're willing to give up and how much you're able to adapt. So a big thing for power is that it's all about sort of that neurological stimulus and being able to get your body to turn on fast and really switch on. So for someone like yourself that's done such a multitude of disciplines, and a lot of those disciplines do involve a lot of endurance, the message your body needs to receive to become more powerful and have a faster rate of force development has got to be so strong that the body's learning to move differently. And if you even give it the inkling of doing some endurance stuff, it's going to go, oh, we like this, let's go back to doing that method. So I guess it's 100% trainable. The level that it can be trained depends on what you're going to do moving forward.
The other aspect layer to that is that I'm in my mid-40s and I've had a lot of injuries, and you know, any time I approach a fingerboard and pull maximally, there's almost like this little memory of all the injuries that my fingers and elbows and shoulders have had, and I have to overcome that to develop maximal force, especially quickly.
And I think this is one thing that particularly as athletes get older, power is something that starts to drop off a lot quicker than maybe some of the other attributes. But once again, in terms of like how to do this safely, it's such a balancing act, isn't it? In terms of you can definitely develop power, because realistically power should be done at a lower intensity. If you look at any sort of basic exercises, we're looking at 40 to 60% MVC. So could we develop power at a lower intensity, which will hopefully make the neurological changes but without the structural damage?
That's it. And is this going to hurt?
Hopefully not. The critical force is definitely going to be it's going to be uncomfortable.
I'm psyched. I like training pain. So cool, let's do it. First task in the testing protocol is to jump on the scales, and I was 65.4 kilos. My weight varies a lot, as I've discussed in previous videos, and this is something to keep in mind when considering my results. This weight is roughly in the middle of my range, which varies depending on what kind of diet I eat. Next up was the warm-up process, first climbing around on the board and then familiarising with progressively harder hangs on the force plate. You can see that I'm gearing myself up mentally for an all-out effort, because it takes a great deal of motivation to actually produce your true maximum strength. On my first efforts with a half crimp, I could pull off the ground and hang with one hand, so in subsequent sets I held a weight in the other hand to stay on the floor and keep the testing standardised. Even with a small weight, I could still lift off the ground, but a 10 kg kettlebell kept my feet on the floor. Although the comparison with others in Lattice's dataset is usually done with a half crimp grip, we also tested my 3-finger drag grip, which I use quite a lot and I really like for all types of climbing, and more discussion of that in just a second. I'm definitely a few kilograms stronger in this grip, but in my normal training I try not to let the other grips fall too far behind. Today I'm slightly weaker on the right arm. That's normally the stronger one, despite, or perhaps because, I'm left-handed. But the right arm is still noticeably weak just now after a recent elbow injury in 2021. Finally, we tested the rate of force development, which is trying to go from no pulling to maximal as quickly as possible.
Is there anything that you think you see in your climbing or in other people's climbing which doesn't get talked about? Like say like your front 3 drag, do you think people are just not utilising that skill set?
I do. I actually like that. I have thought of doing a video just talking about the 3-finger drag, and I think I would say that I at least suspect that it's underrated. Just purely through my own experience of how much more relaxed it feels. I mean, I feel that it allows me to continue up either long boulder problems or routes when otherwise I would fall off, just because you can hit the holds and not have to do anything else. Even that adjustment, I always, you hit a hold and then you do the adjust and then you go, oh no, I just can't. But if I hit it 3-finger drag, I still feel like I can pull on it. I don't know if that's...
a lot more, it needs a lot less muscle mass to stabilise the wrist, doesn't it, really, in that position? So.
Interestingly, see that flat jug there, that's quite flat. On my own fingerboard, the jug is not, it's not like a real sinker jug, you know, so if we're doing like a one-arm pull-up, I find it way harder doing off the jug on the fingerboard than I do just off like a handle on the wall. And I think maybe my wrist flexors and extensions are weak, possibly because they've also been injured a lot.
So that might be why that.
And I wonder if that's why that feels so good, because it just doesn't take so much stabilisation.
To be fair, actually, anecdotally, that kind of actually makes sense when I think about the people that I know that do well in those positions, and then you get them to do anything like a false grip, you know, like a grip strength, kind of like wrist wrench type thing. They do struggle with that. Okay, that's all the easy bits done.
After a short break, we moved on to the critical force test, and I prepared myself again to produce a decent effort and to endure the pain of 4 minutes of all-out pulling. This test is very simple: 7 seconds on, 3 seconds off, for 4 minutes, with every contraction from start to finish being maximal.
4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, pull, max all the way, come on. Nice. Really
go on.
Perfect. Come on, Dave, come on.
I'll speed up this footage while we discuss what the test actually measures. The test produces two metrics of interest, and you can see them in this figure from a paper that the Lattice team published recently on the testing protocol. In part A, you can see that over the course of the first minute or two, there is rapid fatigue and loss of force, consistent with drawing on anaerobic energy systems and fast muscle fibres to produce so much force. In the last 2 minutes, and particularly the last minute, you can see that although the athlete's already fatigued and continues to produce a maximal effort, the force they produce levels out and remains consistent. This plateau of force production represents the steady state that the athlete can sustain for a much longer period, their critical force. It's often referred to as base endurance or aerobic base. The level of this base is going to play a big part in the grade of climbing you can keep going on while completely pumped. In actual climbing, other factors play a role too. Technique and psychological ability, for one thing, but notably, body weight plays a role too. Note that in the climber represented in this figure, critical force settles out at just under 20 kilos, and it's going to matter a lot whether that climber weighs 50 kilos or 90 kilos. For this reason, critical force tends to be expressed as a percentage of body weight to give a meaningful measure for that particular climber. The second metric shown in part B of the figure is W', the area under the curve that lies above the level of critical force. It's sometimes thought of as a measure of anaerobic endurance, although it's more complicated than that and difficult to pin down. We'll discuss it briefly with my results in a moment.
Come on, 20 seconds left, 20 seconds, come on, last two. Last two, make them count, come on. Good, come on, that's good. Nice, last one. Big finish, come on, big finish. Come on. Yeah, come on. Nice, you done. Good work. Well done. Excellent.
Wow. Cool.
Good fun, isn't it?
Oh,
this is very good.
Yeah. Oh dear.
Very good.
Good effort. Savage.
Oh my god, that's it. I'll never climb again.
It's just like in the past 10 seconds, suddenly feel much better again.
Go and see what you can pull.
What I could do now.
Yeah, see how quickly you can recover your force. Also, I was thinking stuff like that, looking at like how fast you actually force. It's like
nice.
Really quick.
Cool.
Yeah.
So that was about 50 kilos, 50. And you were on about 69ish when you were at your peak.
Yeah, I feel like, you know, if I was at a knee bar or something,
yeah,
you know, I could probably do an 88 to the end.
Yeah. But if it was anything like harder and snappier, it just might be a bit.
Yeah, if you had like a font 7B crux or something, then I'd fall off.
Yeah.
Before discussing my results, we briefly did a few other exploratory exercises after talking through possible weaknesses in my upper body. This wasn't a full assessment of those aspects, but it was enough of a starting place to raise suspicion that this could be an area of weakness for me at the moment.
So we've just got the results in. We've done several tests now actually, and we decided to do, so obviously you're so good on the front 3 drag, is we did 4 fingers, which is our normal testing, for MVC, RFD, and used a half crimp. And then we did the critical force in that position. And then we've also got the comparison with front 3 drag. So when we look at the numbers and your top peak score on your half crimp, we had 107%, just over, and then around 103% for your left and right hand comparison. The fade on both of those was actually really good. So your ability for that contractile force over 10 seconds is actually exceptional. So in terms of your peak force, not only is your peak force good, but the ability to hold it and sustain close to that for 10 seconds is really, really good. I think this is once again one of those examples where maybe being a climber that will really get into body positions and move their body around holds means that you can hang on for a little bit longer, which is 2 attributes that work well together.
Yeah, so what separates people that can maintain that force for 10 seconds and those that fades quite markedly? What's different in the muscle?
I think generally it's going to be looking at their type of training history in terms of, are they going to have got used to moving through positions quickly or training at high intensity for shorter periods or sustaining it for longer. So it'll be down to sort of the anaerobic energy system and anaerobic energy systems contributing, but I imagine it's going to have a lot to do with muscle mass and muscle fiber types as well. So within that time, realistically, the main thing I would suggest is that it's down to the type of training they usually do, and the way that they move on holds. In terms of peak force, compared to 8C climber, you are at one of the higher ends. So our mean level for that is here in the middle, and you would be close to the highest end of 8C climbers that we see. And we use 8C sport grade because that's what you've done in the last 2 years. And we would say actually based against a 9A climber, which has got your anthropometrics, so a male climber with your height and weight, you would actually be above the mean for finger strength. And then compared to the boulderer for V14, once again you would be slightly over the mean for your anthropometrics, but for V15 slightly under the mean. The reason why we look at the mean and then a range either way is, and the terminology that we've started to use is the fact that just because someone has a lower finger strength, say if you had 91%, which is at the bottom end of the mean, it doesn't mean that you couldn't climb V14 because this is one type. But what it would suggest is that there's only 10% of climbers that have weaker fingers than that would likely to climb that V14. So it all comes down to style at this point. But generally, maximum finger strength I don't think is a weakness. And this is the 4-finger half crimp.
That's the 4-finger half crimp.
That's the 4-finger half
That's
crimp.
my weak grip. Well, that's what I think anyway.
Okay, so for the it is your weak grip. So for the front 3 drags, just open it up. 116% body weight, so significantly stronger. The 10-second fade is a little bit greater actually, so you're able to sustain close to that force for less time. However, when you look at this in context, because the peak force is so high, the end of that 10 seconds is actually relatively close to the start of your half crimp 10 seconds. So it's more likely to fade off because it's higher. And this is another reason why, in terms of what goes on in the muscle, those with a higher peak force generally will look to fade earlier on, just because it is so hard to sustain that maximal
massive force for a long time.
In terms of where that puts you, you're above the top end of 9A climbers that we worked with in that, if we had that grip position. And then in terms of V14 and V15, you're above the mean significantly, but not at the top end. So front 3 drag is definitely an attribute that you should be proud of. It's an asset to be used. Okay, so now
I definitely feel like I milk it.
So now we look at rate of force development. This is that contact strength, that ability to apply force quickly. as we discussed earlier, obviously there's a little bit of a technique element to this,
Yes,
doing it on the
yes.
board. However, one thing I would suggest is, and you can see the graphs down here, it's this is the area which is lower. And this is at the bottom end of our scales for both 8C and 9A climbers, and it's slightly off the chart for V14 and V15. So in terms of your ability to get towards that maximum strength in the fastest time possible, it's the rate of force development which we find to be the major area to improve.
Yeah, that's interesting. And with the general data set, do people tend to if they're say they're hitting the mean for the maximal force, are they likely to be about the mean for both? Do you normally see a big discrepancy?
I think it's actually been a surprising mixture. It's been completely individual. I've seen people that would be on the bottom end of the maximal force and the top end for rate of force development, and then vice versa. It's actually been really interesting for me working with some younger athletes recently that have become quite fixated on hanging off a fingerboard on one arm with the maximum weight, which it's great to see that strength gain. But their rate of force development is really low, and then when you discuss the climbing with them, and how they feel on the wall, they feel like their fingers are still a weakness. So this is kind of where that inference earlier came from, is that sometimes we feel that it's our finger strengths that are weak, but actually it's the ability to switch that on.
Yeah, so possibly that's the case with me. So I do often feel that even when I have done the hardest boulder problems that I've done, I've almost done them with a kind of trad style, quite control. Either do them controlled or I don't do them.
Yeah, and I think this is where, like we said before, where because you're very good tactically and technically, you can really fine tune the movements to reduce the need for contact strength.
Yeah, possibly I'm compensating for my lack of strength. That aspect of strength.
And it's the same with front three drag actually. So both grip positions are significantly below the mean for your ability level, and that's something for me which would be a major thing, depending on your goals moving forward, would be something to work on. And maybe focus less on the slower loading and more on the power of that loading more regularly in training.
I mean, I've injured myself quite a few times on the campus board, and I must admit it has taken me away from the campus board. And
maybe sort of those sort of board style climbing, it's trying to work out that balance between trying to work on more snappier climbing where you can't get away with the technique versus you don't want to lose that ability to really work and milk positions.
The thing is, like on my board, I already feel like I try to set problems to force myself to do that, where the footholds are lacking, and I can't rely on my technique to do things slowly, and I have to be like bang, hit the hold, and I often think of climbing in that way when I'm training. I actually say that to myself. I'm like, bang, hit that hold and don't let go. But it's despite that, it's still a weakness.
I guess the thing is as well, this is compared to one, your highest level, and two, an exceptional finger strength. So
True.
I guess that is another element that maybe if you were a lot weaker, or we were looking at sort of the grades you're climbing more frequently, like a lower level, it would be quite good.
Yes.
But in terms of, because that area is already so well developed, it would be still worth trying to be snappier on the board.
And do you think, given the finger strength I've got, if, it's a hypothetical, but if you could get that rate force development to just come up to the mean for those grades, would I really feel that in my climbing?
Potentially. It's always an unknown. This is just a starting point, and what I would say is it would be worth the intervention to find out. And it might not change your ability on certain boulders or moves, because you would still require that static position to move because the holds are so bad or so small. But it might mean that you have more access to that grade on a mixture of types of climbing. So something where you can't get away with the high level of tactics and technique. So basic boulders, if you want to go and do basic boulders on V15 level, it might be something that did make a significant difference.
Yeah, interesting.
In terms of critical force, then the fun part that
Yes, I
you
know.
tried really
That
hard
was-
on. Actually, it was great to watch because
Yeah.
we can. One thing that's really interesting for us is we can tell when people are holding back because it goes up and down, and you can really tell he's pacing, and you are not pacing at all.
No, I wasn't
So-
pacing. No, well, I certainly did feel like it to me. I was giving it everything I could.
And so you scored 43.7% body weight held for critical force. So that means 43% of your body weight you will be able to sustain until skin or energy stores or mindset kind of gives up.
Yeah.
Which is exceptional. It's really, really high. It's actually one of the highest scores that we've measured.
All right. Well.
If you look at sort of the means for 9A and 8C, you're significantly over the mean. And the percentage changes is relatively small per grade. It's only a couple of percent, but it is relatively consistent and reliable testing. And then for boulders, it is obviously a little bit less applicable because it's looking at the long end.
Yes.
But it does help us get an idea about where we stand moving forward for recovery and your ability to do lots of hard training. So all that trad climbing has definitely paid off. The 1 minute effort, so we also look at W prime, and this needs to be taken into account in the whole picture because with a really high critical force and MVC, W prime is going to be affected.
So what is W prime?
So W prime, in the most simple terms, is looking at the effort that you can do, which has a time limit on it. So it's the higher energy substrates that you're going to be using, and it's going above that intensity threshold where the time is on. You're not going to be able to sustain this, and the whole W prime where it isn't sort of a particular intensity. It's a variety of that intensity, but it's looking at the time, the intensity where you can't sustain this. So most people refer to it as power endurance, but that's a whole other complicated matter of terminology.
Sure,
With regards to that is an area which is actually still really good, considering you've got a high level of base endurance and MVC. So for me, your energy systems training and your ability to sustain effort, to train regularly and work on sustained climbing terrain that's highly intense is very, very good. Your ability to exert force in a controlled manner is extremely good. And the one area that we found to improve on the forearm is potentially the power and rate of force development.
Yeah.
Does that feel kind of marry up with what you found in your climbing, or is it a surprise?
I'm overall surprised that my physical capabilities across the board are as good as they are, and it immediately makes me think I should be trying harder. I should be on harder routes. Yeah. I mean, I've always felt like, do I have 9A plus in me? And I feel like I ought to have the tactics, experience, technique to get a grade over whatever my strength level is. So if my strength level and endurance suggests, like based on kind of comparison to other people, that I should be at 9A, then I feel like I should be able to do 9A plus. If not, maybe even 9B.
Yeah. Well, based on this, I'd put money on you.
Although it's funny, like I go and try 9As, and like the continuous endurance ones feel desperate. I just never. I don't think I've ever really felt endurance fit ever.
Yeah. I think one thing that we find interesting with this testing, and we used some examples earlier, which it shows that maybe in terms of your ability to recover between holds and in set positions could be good, but because of the limitations of this testing. For that sort of sustained effort, it might show that actually on that really sustained climbing, that is something that you would struggle to move quickly through, because that type of climbing tends to make you move a lot faster, where you're not able to milk this sort of endurance and that reperfusion of oxygen as you come off the wall if you're having to push through. And then my other area of interest would also be what's happening in the rest of the body, because your technique and tactics are obviously extremely good, and what seems to be going on from the testing in your forearms is very good, but is there other elements of your muscularity which isn't able to cope as well with that type of terrain? Are you able to sustain the stability in your back, your upper body, you're pushing between holds on that sustained climbing, which you might not notice on the shorter stuff, but on that longer stuff, is that an area that needs to improve?
Yeah. And how might I find that out?
For me, it comes down to, we go and play with a few little weights, we do some weighted exercises, but right now, if we're honest, we don't have the data and the right testing methodology to look at the entire picture in that sustained way. We were joking earlier about doing critical force on a mid-thigh pull, which would make everyone sick. But I guess, like we do with every athlete, this is a really good starting point. This gives us an idea about what potentially we could do in an intervention. And now it's a case of what you're great at: test, reassess, evaluate, intervene. And for me, I would look at what muscles are strong and weak. Could we do an intervention that proves that this is an area that is useful? And then do we reassess and decide whether we continue down that path, or is it a distraction?
Just thinking of that critical force test, like one completely different aspect that I'm interested in is I do, as you know, lots of mad diet experiments, and so for the last what are we now, towards the end of February, so nearly 2 months, I've eaten a carnivore diet, very little carbohydrate, like very little, but not none, probably 30 grams a day. So that's an ongoing experiment. I'm starting to endurance train. I've done maybe 3.5 weeks, not really large volumes or anything, but I have done some. And so I'm interested, am I going to bump up against a limit in terms of the amount of glycogen I have in order to just complete the training and also have performance? But so given that information, do you find anything surprising or not from the critical force test?
To be honest, I would actually, it'd be wrong of me to pretend that I understand enough of the mechanistic levels on this. I think one thing that would stand out to me is, as you've kind of really well explained on your channel, is just because you're on a low carbohydrate diet doesn't necessarily mean the glycogen stores are going to be depleted or lower all the time. So during a 1-day testing methodology, I cannot see why that would come up with an issue. And the other side is, we've kind of ended up being pigeonholed down the years in terms of testing to provide terminology and explanations of what's going on within the muscles. And the reason why the critical force test works so well is it's an outcome-based test. So it's what load can you produce and sustain after a certain level or time period. The mechanisms behind that, above that level and below that level, are still unknown to us, exactly what's going on between different people, whether it's the contributions anaerobically, aerobically, and a lot of people want to be categorized into what stores are being used and what energy systems are being used. And it's so complicated, and a lot of sports science literature isn't even there yet, let alone climbing literature. So for me to go into this thinking about glycogen stores with your critical force, I can't see a reason why it would be affected, and if it was, I don't think we have the information right now to understand why that actually occurred. And maybe it would be worth retesting on different diets, and that would be the simplest method.
Absolutely, yeah. It still is surprising and reassuring that you would say that aspect is exceptionally good. And I must really think through like the implications of that. Like, why would it be good? I mean, I don't feel like I've ever had good endurance in climbing.
I think it's really interesting that so looking at the comparisons with other people, and this isn't so we're not looking at saying that yours is good compared to grade now. We're looking at percentage body weight, which I think has its own repercussions. But because obviously your strength is very high, but it's been so nice that we've tested people with higher finger strength with similar critical force and lower finger strength with similar critical force that were all elite and climbing at a similar level. And one thing that stands out to me is the years climbing and consistent volume is what often produces high critical force. The people with lower critical force are those that their training goes up and down a lot more frequently. Their volume tends to be a bit lower, or they've not climbed for as many years. or to be relatively blunt about it, they can't try that hard for that long.
Yes.
Because I think there's such a mental component with being able to give everything for 4 minutes.
Yeah.
And it seems like you've practiced that pretty well over the years.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's. I would think so. Yeah. I mean, I'm speculating, but I would think that long-term consistency would lead to changes in the muscle fibre type as much as they can change towards what would be optimal, given the training you're doing, and just mitochondrial density in the muscle.
Yeah, all those components, whether it's sort of the components in the enzymes, or whether it's your mitochondrial density, capillarization, the contributions of different muscle fibers, and also you got your muscle coordination, intramuscular coordination within the forearm. We know changing grip position changes how that contributes. All of those things will be changed by your recent training history, but also the amount that you've done. And you would say, as a multidiscipline athlete, you've gone through multiple changes, but that multidiscipline aspect has been consistent, and you've been able to train all aspects regularly for a very long time. And we often see that with people that do that, it does create a very consistent base level. So I would actually hypothesize that if you change your diet dramatically, I don't expect that number to change much at all.
Yeah. I mean, overall, the first thing that comes to mind in general from all of that is just like, I should be trying harder routes.
Cool. If it means you go and get on a harder route, I'm psyched.
Yeah, maybe I should not be too scared to go and try a 9A plus or a 9B.
Well, I think based on the results, there's no reason to avoid it.
Yeah.
I don't want to take full credit if you send a 9A plus, but I'm happy to say we've pushed you in the right direction.
Yeah, cool. All right, great. Thanks very much. I enjoyed the testing, and I'd like to say thanks to Ollie and Maddie and all the team at Lattice for the invite for a session. I was sort of hoping that there would be some sort of challenge to my personal view of my own strengths and weaknesses, and maybe even some surprises, and I would say that I got both. I did find it surprising that my basic finger strength and the critical force was as good as it was, and it was really interesting to see that force development was so poor. I think the biggest takeaway that I have from the whole of the testing was that I possibly have the potential to improve further, and it made me question whether the routes that I've pointed myself at are really as hard as my body is capable of. To think that I've underestimated myself is not actually something that I'm all that comfortable with. I actually see it as the ultimate failure as an athlete, aside from cheating or bad sportsmanship. But with that said, I think I would forgive myself maybe, given that I switch between several different disciplines in climbing, and perhaps I'm just not doing enough bouldering and sport climbing to be really sensitive to what my true potential in those disciplines is. It's quite difficult for me as the athlete to look at these results fairly, because inherent in being a good athlete is being dissatisfied with everything all the time and constantly striving to make every aspect of performance better. Although my initial emotional reaction to them is to be disappointed that I've not leveraged the strength that I evidently have to climb harder routes, there is a bit more to it than that. That rate of force development stood out as being markedly poor, perhaps reflecting caution after past injuries, and perhaps reflecting all the trady ledge shuffling type climbing that I do. If I could navigate a course of training to safely improve that one component, maybe it would be like a missing piece of the jigsaw that would allow me to climb something like a 9A+. Well, there's only one way to find out. I should really allow myself to think that the fact that I had such good scores for so many measures of strength and endurance in climbing raises the likelihood that I have actually made some good decisions in my own training. If I hadn't, how could I have actually arrive at this point? Well, it is possible for athletes to succeed despite and not because of the training decisions that they make, which is always why you should be careful in copying what individual athletes do. Anecdotes are useful, but they're unreliable compared to well-executed scientific studies. Unfortunately, at the moment, we don't have science that can tell you exactly how to train for climbing and how that might differ from the next person. Another thing about anecdotes is that they increase in their reliability if their effects are consistent in one direction over a long time. So I climbed my first E11 way back in 2006, and I actually climbed another one just a few weeks after I did this testing at Lattice. So the question is, what factors might explain that? Consistency is perhaps the most important word in the whole of training science, and I do suspect that one reason why I might have got such good scores is that I've given my body time to adapt, and I've patiently and consistently trained over many years. That means not pushing too hard in good times, but also not forgetting to push through the bad times. And in practice, that would mean things like still taking rest days, even when I feel good, but still showing up and doing some, maybe modified training when things are far from perfect. That's being willing to stick to a training plan, but also being willing to deviate from it. I also had some more specific takeaways from the testing. With that good critical force, I suspect that it would be possible for me to build some good endurance if I did the right training. But as I said, I'm often switching between climbing disciplines, and I don't usually train endurance for long enough to yield decent results. I just tend to go climbing instead. The testing gives me a bit more confidence that a focused intervention could yield a good result if I need it for a given project. With the rate of force development, I could also intervene to improve that aspect too, but the combination of a history of injuries from training, power training at high velocity, as well as my age and the changes in tendon stiffness that go along with that, make that kind of risky. The net effect of the intervention could be a huge net negative for my climbing if it results in a torn tendon or ligament. So I will have to think about that carefully and try and make an educated guess as to the risk that I'm willing to make and an appropriate load and ramping of the load and also the mode of training. Possibly a good place to start would be a limited volume of campus board, maybe some foot-off bouldering and some calisthenics, as well as maybe a slight shift in the setting on my bouldering wall in favour of more powerful styles. One final thing to say is that these ideas are logical speculation based on quite limited data. This sort of test is really useful, but as an adjunct and not a substitute for ongoing intensive observation and tweaking and reflecting of every aspect of your climbing. You need all the ingredients to come together to make the most of your potential in our sport, which is very technical. In hard rock climbing, raw strength is necessary but not sufficient. Okay, see you in the next episode.